Welcome to the podcast, The Special Educators Corner. My name is Karsten Skrulle-Gundersen, and I wish you a most warmly welcome to my corner of special education. Today, on the celebration of the 3 years anniversary of the podcast, you will in this special episode hear my conversation with Jo Van Herwegen, Professor in Developmental Psychology and Education at King's College London. In this third and so far final episode about Williams syndrome, I talked to Professor Van Herwegen about what Williams syndrome is, the characteristics, the educational and lifelong aspect, among other things. With that, my conversation with Professor Van Herwegen. Perfect. And with that, I would like to welcome to another episode of the podcast Corner of Special Education, and a new episode in the series Let's Talk About. And today's topic, the topic of this episode is Williams syndrome, and it's a part of the main topic of this the current season, season 6 is rare diagnosis, and Williams syndrome is absolutely in that category. So, as always, I have a guest with me that has agreed to participate in this episode and to share her knowledge about this syndrome. So, with that, I would like to give a big welcome, and why don't you give a short introduction about yourself?
Thank you very much, Karsten. So I'm Jo Van Herwegen. I'm a professor of developmental psychology and education at the Institute of Education at UCL in London.
Perfect. Welcome. And just to start, what is Williams syndrome?
Well, as you mentioned, Karsten, Williams syndrome is a rare genetic condition. It occurs in about, well, depends on which study you read, about 1 in 25,000 to 1 in 50,000. But to put that of live births, but to put that in perspective, if we think about Down syndrome, it's about 1 in 800 children. If you think about, autism at the moment, we're thinking about 1 in 90 to 1 in 100. So if we think, even though we might think, well, 1 in 25,000 or 1 in 50,000 is a large difference, it is. Even if it's 1 in 25,000, it's a rare genetic condition.
Absolutely.
And the condition is caused by a sporadic deletion of one of the long arms of chromosome 7. And so the deletion of that genetic material results in the condition that we know as Williams syndrome.
Correct. Now, I have before the recording of this episode, I have had the privilege of doing 2 additional recordings about Williams syndrome. I have spoken with a person from Frambu, which is a center for rare diagnosis here in Norway, and also a person, an adult with Williams syndrome here in Norway, and also the cheerleader of the Norwegian Foundation for Williams syndrome. So hopefully that will provide a great broader perspective of this syndrome. But if it's possible, could you give me and the listener a brief historic summary of this syndrome?
The syndrome was discovered sometimes in the 60s in New Zealand, but also in Germany. So there were actually 2 psychiatrists that described the condition independently, but of course identified similar features. So at the time, some of these children were identified as having Elfin syndrome or infantile hypercalcelium syndrome. And that's because most individuals with Williams syndrome have specific facial features that's caused by the deletion of ELN, one of the genes that is deleted on the long arm of chromosome 7. And so many people with Williams syndrome might have, a smaller chin, a longer nasal bridge, slightly wider gaps between the eyes. And so people have referred to it as they might resemble a bit of a pixie face or an elfin face, and so that's where Elfin syndrome came from. And then the other name of infantile hypercalcemia comes from the fact that a lot of children, not just children, but mainly children, but also still adults, have often hypercalcemia, so they don't break down calcium or in the same way that other people might do. So when they drink milk, they might be affected by the calcium milk. And that's where the names come from. Of course, over time, it was then referenced as the Williams-Buren syndrome, Williams being the New Zealand psychiatrist and Buren being the German.
Okay, I see.
And so in Europe, people refer to it as Williams-Buren syndrome. But in America and in England, where I'm working, we more often say Williams syndrome rather.
Oh, okay. So you use different terms.
Exactly. So there's known as many different terms. In older papers, you will read about hypercalcemia or the Elfin syndrome. You might read as the Williams-Buren syndrome, Williams syndrome.
That's interesting. I actually haven't, I've learned and read a lot about this syndrome, and also through the different conversation. But that point I have slipped in those situations. So interesting fact, absolutely. Now, what do we know about how the syndrome affects the individual in both in a more physical appearance and what do we know about that?
Well, we know a lot about the physical appearances. As I mentioned before, there's a specific facial features. There's also the fact that many individuals with Williams syndrome have shorter statures, so they're shorter than the average population. And actually, that has resulted in the fact that within the UK, we've developed some growth curves. I don't know if you do the same in Norway, but we have these growth curves, for children when they're born. We've developed the ones for Williams syndrome because they're so larger than individuals, than neurotypical individuals. And so it's difficult for parents sometimes to know, like, well, my child's got Williams syndrome, but are they putting on enough weight? Are they growing enough? So
are they reaching the goals?
The milestones for that. So develops those kind of guidance, during growth curves. There are a lot of medical implications for people with Williams syndrome. And again, a lot of that is caused by the deletion of ELN. The reason I mention is that ELN is elastin. And if you think about where you might find elastin in the body, it's in your skin, it's in your veins, it's in the brain, it's in your face, right? So it's in everything. So what you see is there's a main concern is around SVAS, which is supravalvular aorta stenosis. Basically, it means a narrowing of the main aorta from the heart, and that causes a heart murmur. And so this is why we see, especially in Western countries, an earlier diagnosis of Williams syndrome, because the first thing that doctors do when a baby is born is they'll listen to the heart. If they hear a heart murmur, 2 weeks later, in most children, that heart murmur will go away. But in children with Williams syndrome, it doesn't. And because many infants with Williams syndrome, because of their hypercalcemia, have problems with milk, you'll see infants who have a heart murmur who are not feeding well and are fussy, as we call them. They're bad sleepers, they cry a lot, and they then have smaller growth as well, and the Elfin like facial feature. If you put those together, that's how in the past, or still now, a lot of young infants get their diagnosis for Williams syndrome before there's a genetic test.
Correct.
So that's kind of the younger children. But then as children get older, we see difficulties in terms of some gastro difficulties, irritable bowel syndrome, for example, hernias, curvature of the spine. Now, again, some of these are very rare. They don't always happen to all children with Williams syndrome. We don't want to scare everybody in terms of the medical impact. The most medical impact is the SVAS of the heart, as well as the hypercalcemia seem to be two important ones. And I think that's it. So I think that's it. And as they get older, of course, there are, other issues related to walking, mobility, again, related to ELN diagnostic.
Correct. Now, as I mentioned, I previously recorded a conversation with an adult with Williams syndrome, and I had the privilege of being his school assistant back in 2008 and 9. So we hadn't had contact after that before this summer or the summer of 25. So quite the time lapse from 08 and 9 to now. But from my knowledge of people with or individuals with Williams syndrome, they are quite social and friendly, and they like the conversation, and also they are quite the musicians, instrumental. So could you just give us a context around that?
Yes, so we talked about the medical profile.
Yeah.
But yes, indeed, they come with a very specific, what we call cognitive and behavioral profile. So behaviorally, as you mentioned, a lot of them are what we call overtly looking for social aspects, right? So they love looking at people's faces. They love talking to people. However, when we say they're very sociable, we must put that in context, is that a lot of them also have social anxiety and don't necessarily have the capacity to keep conversations going. So you might find a lot of repetitiveness in that conversation. I don't know how it goes with the adults that you interview, but a lot of the times
sounds familiar. Absolutely
sounds familiar. How are you? I'm well, thank you. How are you? We can keep for a while.
And the same topics over again.
Same topics.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's part of their social aspect. A lot of people mention that they are quite musical. And again, we need to kind of caveat that in that a lot of them love music. A lot of them have a big affinity towards the music, but it doesn't mean that all of them are musical in the way that they don't necessarily have the ability to learn new music, or it doesn't mean that
enjoy it.
They enjoy it. Yes, they love music. It's a great way to express themselves. Again, we see in a lot of young children that they're quite positive in their way of thinking, quite overt, want to be part of the party.
Enthusiastic.
Yeah, very enthusiastic, absolutely. But then again, I think at older we kind of see a little bit more of that, anxiety coming in, highly anxious, kind of dissociating themselves from society as they get older.
Okay.
They're at higher risk for depression as they get older. And I think that might be because, as you get older, if you've had a lot of rejections, you want to be with other people, but you don't necessarily have the skills to maintain conversations. You want to be part of society, but you might not be able to drive a car or maintain, a work. That I think that's kind of why we see that kind of higher anxiety, higher level of depression as they get older. But lovely people to work with. I've worked with people with Williams syndrome for, over 25 years. And, always some of them are really interested in planes and know everything about planes. Others might know everything about trains, hoovers. So they tend to have very specific interests that they are their favorite topics of conversation. In terms of their cognitive abilities, and I've talked already a little bit about it, we'll see that there is a range, there's a wide variability, with some people being nonverbal and having very low IQs and others being within what we call the typical range, right?
Yeah.
So on average, we see that most people with Williams syndrome have intellectual disabilities or difficulties, IQ scores between 50 and 75 on average. But as I said, there's a wide range in them. And then what is interesting is that their cognitive abilities aren't what we call even. So they tend to have much better language abilities compared to their nonverbal abilities. So if you ask, people to make a puzzle or draw something or find their way from going from point A to point B, which are all nonverbal spatial abilities, we see a lot of difficulties.
Correct.
Almost all of them. Compared to then stronger verbal skills in terms of their narrative abilities, great storytelling, A lot of them have got great memories, especially for things that they're interested in, but not good memories when it comes to mathematical abilities or skills, for example.
The typical school tasks. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Also, it might be good memory for history, but then mathematics, which is maybe more spatial ability, it's very good visuospatial abilities, we then see difficulties in those academic areas as well.
Correct. Now, I think, well, yeah, my master's degree, I actually wrote about Williams syndrome. So it's always been a fascination for me, and I've always had this, been intrigued of this syndrome. Also, but the social skills and the musical side of it. Do we know why this is?
Well, there are a couple of theories who have not really been researched in too much detail, but we know that people with Williams syndrome have very sensitive hearing. Now, again, that doesn't mean that they can hear better than others. They can hear particular frequencies better than others. There's also a theory that they might focus more on the details than on the overall contour of things. So when we come into a classroom, you and me, we go like, oh, chairs, table, whiteboard, it's a classroom. But we don't go, oh, there was a red bin in the corner and there was a green curtains, because that's the detail that brain filters that out. But what we see is that people with Williams syndrome tend to focus on those kind of details a lot more.
Correct.
And so what it might mean is that, the way they perceive the world is slightly differently. And especially when it comes to auditory perception, they're quite good with that. So that makes you quite musical in a way.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that they have perfect pitch. It's just the fact they've got good memory for that. And then the same thing in terms of describing their social abilities, they love looking at faces. And they tend to look a lot more at people's faces than anything else. And so that makes them, there is a study that has looked at their amygdala, which is the part of the brain that lights up when you look at faces, the reward system.
Yeah.
And it lights up a lot more in people with Williams syndrome when they look at you compared to neurotypical. So the reward of looking at a face for them is like, eating a chocolate. It feels good. It's great.
Okay.
And so they tend to do that a lot more. Now, if you do that a lot more, you become better at recognizing faces. People with Williams syndrome tend to also be not only good at recognizing faces, but also remembering faces. So that's a strength for them. Now, that also explains some of the difficulties, because if you don't move your eyes at the right time, at the right place, you will miss out on information. So thinking about a young baby with Williams syndrome who's learning new words, in typically developing children, we see a lot of pointing, right? Young child will point at something, then the parent will point out that is a window, a door, glass, and then the child learns, okay, that object means this. But if you're looking at mummy's face or daddy's face because you love looking at faces and you don't point, or mummy says something but you don't follow mummy's eyes, so you don't know what is she meaning, you're going to lose out on learning opportunities and visuospatial abilities as well over time. So you can already see how the fact that they develop differently from infancy onwards kind of makes that discrepancy between being very good at music because they focus more on details and fine perception. Looking at faces gives them, a bigger reward in terms of the brain reward system.
Yeah, correct.
It means you then miss out on other information that is important for learning.
Interesting. Now, you were saying that you can identify this syndrome from the infancy. Now, when here in Europe and in the US, are there any differences when it comes to giving the diagnosis of the Williams syndrome? Is there any differences there?
We do see a lot of individual differences, but not necessarily country specific.
No, so from the individual basis, yeah.
Yeah, on an individual basis, we do see a lot of differences. So we do see that overall, we see a lot more younger infants being diagnosed, but we still see individuals who receive their diagnosis quite late.
Okay.
So, when I started 20 years ago, it was quite common to have people diagnosed even in they were adolescents, even when they were adults.
Okay, that late. Okay.
That late, but we don't see that as much. But we might still see some people being diagnosed aged 6 months, some being diagnosed aged 3 to 4 years old.
Okay.
And that is because it's a rare condition.
Yeah.
And so some pediatricians have never heard of it, of Williams syndrome.
Exactly.
Now, also, not all children with Williams syndrome have a heart murmur. Not all children with Williams syndrome have hypercalcemia. And not all children with Williams syndrome have necessarily the facial characteristics. So for some children, it might just take a while before it's quite clear, like there are some differences, but where do these differences come from? And so for some children, especially then if the pediatrician might never have heard of the condition, that these individuals are picked up later and get a diagnosis later on.
Correct.
But in terms of the diagnosis, it's the same across countries. They still take, a sample of blood and it's genetically confirmed whether or not the individual has Williams syndrome.
Correct. One side is how it affects the individual. But when it comes to the knowledge of, we are talking about a rare diagnosis here. And in your opinion, how is the knowledge about this rare syndrome in the US and here in Europe? What do we know about that?
Well, it's very rare. So, I've been asked this question a number of times, like, shouldn't all doctors, all medical doctors have training on Williams syndrome? And what about teachers? And well, the problem is that most doctors will never come across a person with Williams syndrome.
Is that rare? Yeah.
It's that rare. The question is, we probably can't train every doctor and every teacher on Williams syndrome. But of course, it's difficult because what that means is that very often the parent of the child with Williams syndrome becomes their
expert, advocate. Yeah.
Absolutely. Expert and advocate, I think, both of them, And of course, that is not always easy as a parent when you have to tell your doctor.
You have to lecture the doctor in a way.
Exactly. So we have been thinking in the UK around how we can make this better. So whether we could, for example, we've developed some short training courses for teachers. We've developed guidance for teachers and for GPs that is freely available. They just have to go to the website, download it and read it. How we can encourage them more that if they are working with a person with Williams syndrome or they're supporting a patient with Williams syndrome, that at least they go and check out the guidelines. But even that is not always a possibility.
Well, I think that, it's, again, it's a very rare diagnosis. And with that, the knowledge would, of course, be quite spare in the different areas. But hopefully, that you and I are talking here and can play a small part in providing the knowledge. So but when it comes to how this syndrome affects the individual, it's also a matter of how it affects the family and caretakers and siblings. And what do we know about that?
So it's not my area of expertise. There are colleagues who've looked at sibling relationships in terms of Williams syndrome. Most of the siblings have very good relations with their individual with Williams syndrome because of the affectionate nature of people with Williams syndrome. They're highly concerned. They would like to be involved. But of course, it's not always easy because especially not for families in that, some people with Williams syndrome might have some severe sensory difficulties. So we have young people who are absolutely anxious and petrified about laughter. Now, if you think about, it could be laughter, it could be balloons, it could be sirens.
High sounds.
not as it could be high sense, but sometimes it could also be very specific. Nail varnish is another one, you know. So it can be very specific and almost I'm trying to look for the word now. When you're so scared of something, it becomes a pathology. Anyways. So we have families who, for example, can't go outside because their child might run away, doesn't see danger. We have families who can't go to social events because you can't control when other people are laughing or not. And it can trigger an entire breakdown. So whilst people with Williams syndrome are very sociable, some families are experiencing very difficult times because of the sensory processing difficulties that their children might experience. And of course, then the knock-on effect that might have on siblings, that in terms of what you can do together as a family, or what attention you get when you have a sibling who requires a lot more attention from the parents, basically.
So it sounds, well, of course, this goes for every individual, but when it comes to the profile of each individual, and also including persons with Williams syndrome, it sounds like the individual profile, it's quite broad.
It's always interesting because I don't know if this happens in Norway as well, but we in England are fortunate enough that we can meet with the Williams Syndrome Foundation quite regularly. And when everybody comes together, there is this kind of, we're all one family, and look how similar the individuals with Williams syndrome may look or behave or have the same interests, especially around music. And at the same time, as you say, there's lots of differences. So I think they're all kind of like, all of them have special interests. But the special interests might differ. Many of them have sensory processing difficulties, but some of them get over them when they're, quite young, and others never grow out of those, and it remains a problem. All of them have slightly higher anxiety than the typical population, but for some of them, it's only for specific aspects, whereas others have higher anxiety related to almost every aspect of their life. So there is indeed a lot of variability.
Correct. Now, I would say that if you have like ADHD or autism, it's often said that it's more common that you have additional difficulties like dyslexia or etc. Is this the case also for Williams syndrome?
Oh, it's a tricky question, because very often we see that people get a dual diagnosis. But when I assess these children, I don't think they have a dual diagnosis. I think it's the fact that these are, attention difficulties, part of Williams syndrome. The repetitive behaviors we see in some people with Williams syndrome and the higher anxiety or sensory processing difficulties is very similar to what we see in autism. But at the same time, autistic individuals and individuals with Williams syndrome, despite the fact that they have these kind of overlaps, are very different. But a lot of children with Williams syndrome find it difficult to read, but doesn't mean they have dyslexia. I think the difficulties, especially in England, is because Williams syndrome is so rare, teachers and doctors can't just go to a list and go, oh, these are the interventions that we know that work for Williams syndrome. But there's a lot of support for, well, not always a lot, but there is more support for autistic individuals, and there's some support for individuals with ADHD. So in the UK, sometimes parents go for a second diagnosis so that their child can have access to the
precisely,
autism and ADHD. But as an expert on these learning difficulties, I sometimes find it difficult to justify a dual diagnosis, especially if we have to think about what this means long term. So I have met individuals with Williams syndrome who have married, had children, have a job.
Correct. Okay.
And so, but often these individuals didn't have a diagnosis very young. They had, they weren't limited by their label. We know that labels can limit something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So if you were to ask me, would I ever employ a person with Williams syndrome? Absolutely. I think people with Williams syndrome would be fantastic as a receptionist, in musea because, they have this kind of very good memory for teens. There's so many things that people with Williams syndrome can do, but often it involves a social context.
Yeah.
Now, if you then give people a dual diagnosis for also autism, sometimes it might restrict their world even more.
Correct.
I'm not saying that that's always the case. And of course, I have met people with Williams syndrome who also have autism, and it's very clear that they fit both diagnoses, ADHD. But in general, many people with Williams syndrome might have attention difficulties or sensory processing difficulties that look like ADHD and look like autism, but not autistic.
No, so it just looks like it. Yeah,
exactly.
Correct. And it's a part of the Williams syndrome diagnosis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, I always say to parents, it's up to the parents to decide if they think the dual diagnosis will help or hinder.
Yeah, if it would be a benefit or,
But always I advise parents to keep the long-term implications in mind. Will it, over long-term, restrict the individual more, or will it broaden their horizons?
Correct. And we will go into that, the more lifelong perspective in just a bit. But regarding education and learning, that's always interesting when it comes to, a human being, and absolutely when it also comes to different kind of diagnosis. I know you talked a bit about, the mathematics and the different settings in school, but what do these children need in kindergarten and school, and what do we know about how do they best learn?
Oh, a lot of different questions. Right, let me start on. I think the biggest difficulty from a school point of view is the fact that school is based around chronological age. Right? At age 4, we do this. At age 6, we do that. There's a curriculum to follow. And school is a box. And the idea is that everybody fits in the same box at the same time.
That's the idea, yeah.
But of course, children with Williams syndrome, I always say to people, they follow their own developmental pathway. They do everything that neurotypically developing children do, generally. As I said, there's a few that are nonverbal, but most children with Williams syndrome will start to speak. Most children with Williams syndrome will walk, will run, will cycle a bike. But when they do this, might be at a different time point.
Yeah, on a later stage. Yeah.
Exactly. And sometimes, again, very wide variability. So we know typically developing children will start to babble by 9 months, talk by 1 year. We start getting a bit worried if they don't talk by 2 years. Some children with Williams syndrome don't speak until they're 9. And it doesn't mean that they'll have limited language afterwards. I've had cases where they were very verbal afterwards with no problem. So I always say to parents, don't compare to other children. Just focus on your child will do this when the time is right. But getting that into education is very difficult, of course, right? So I always advise, there isn't a lot of evidence out there in terms of education, what works, because we have no interventions for children with Williams syndrome, but we have some longitudinal studies where we're now starting to look at predictions. And in the UK, we would advise for children to start reception year later. So in the UK, children go to school age 4.
Yeah, correct.
Reception class, which is a bit more play-based learning, not formal learning yet. And we would advise to either for children to start that late, but that has an impact sometimes on parents having to pay for preschool, or for children to go, but to repeat that year.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So that they have longer time to settle in. And it's about getting these foundations for learning right. You can only start to read and write and do maths when you can start paying attention, when you have. And a lot of children with Williams syndrome when they're very young don't have the motor abilities yet to sit up straight and hold a pen and do the movements. They need kind of more kindergarten activities of tracing and paying attention and listening to instructions, etc. So that's definitely. And then as children get older, in the UK, we see that most children are included in mainstream school during primary school settings. Some might be involved in primary entire classes for all the social aspects, but then maybe for reading and maths go to smaller remedial classes. But that often works well because, as I said, children with Williams syndrome are quite verbal. They like to be with others. They like to copy others and learn from copying others. So that's kind of an important aspect is to kind of make sure that they can copy from children that have better abilities than them, that can help them scaffold their abilities more. But of course, what we see is that when it comes to secondary school, often the gap between children with Williams syndrome and their peers becomes so big by the time they're 11. And I don't know in Norway, but in England, the secondary schools are large in terms of the number of students. You have to move from class to class every hour because you have a maths class and English class, etc. And so navigating these busy corridors, I mean, people with Williams syndrome are quite vulnerable students. They might trip over. They do get lost even in, well-known environments. They get distracted. And so for their own kind of safety, most parents then look for more special schools that can cater more for their needs and their abilities. Also, at that point, I think a lot of parents are starting to wonder, do I really want my child to pass what we call in England A-levels and go to college or university? Or do I want my child to have very good independent skills? How to take the bus, how to cook, how to look after myself.
ADLD skills.
That's right. So this is where we kind of see the differences. But a lot of children at a young age need one-to-one support because of their, as I mentioned, they don't always look at the right place at the right time.
Correct.
And they get distracted. So to kind of help them learn, it's important to have someone next to them that kind of says, like, did you listen to the instructions?
So they need help to focus on the right.
That's right. And repeat instructions when needed, or give direct feedback, which we know helps with learning as well, etc. So
correct. Now, when it comes to for those who listen to this episode and are either is working as a teacher and are there having a student with Williams syndrome in the class, or are receiving a pupil with Williams syndrome next year, or when it comes to mathematics and language and the more typical topics in a school, I would say that I would guess that it's quite individual how to facilitate different tasks. But is there some more general points we can talk about when it comes to facilitating?
Oh, we can, but as you may know, I've written a book about it that teachers can download for free from the Williams Syndrome Foundation website in England. But I mean, a couple of things I would mention from the book is when it comes about reading, we know that a phonological approach works. So teaching children the sounds and letter combinations. Although some children find that sometimes, again, it can take a long time because they're on a slower pace. Some children also benefit from a whole word recognition because they have such good memory.
Correct. Yeah.
Music. What we do see is that some children have problems with understanding the text, so they can read freely, but won't necessarily know what the essence of the text is.
Correct.
So asking them comprehension questions, so they have to think about the essence of what they were reading, is important. In mathematics, we see a lot of problems with they can do the counting, they can recognize the digits, but again, it's around the meaning. What does it mean, numbers? So again, then working with representative tools such as, I don't know if you know Numicon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Numicon or number lines, very important.
So a visual and concrete. Yeah.
Absolutely, very important. They also don't seem to realize that fingers are a useful tool to help work out problems. They don't use it naturally as a strategy.
They have to learn it.
So teaching them the strategies is that, and we always say you can teach them a lot through music, or what we call mnemonics.
Yeah.
I don't know, these kind of memorable sentences, especially also for things like going to the toilet and washing your hands, not forgetting any steps, like, so to kind of, if a task can be broken down in steps.
Yeah.
And then you
Right.
can teach them a mnemonic or a visual representation of the steps they need to go through to check. It's these kind of tools of breaking things down and giving them concrete materials and giving them visual reminders, or teaching them songs to remember facts. These are the kind of tools and tricks that can help children with Williams syndrome.
Correct. Perfect. Now, we have been talking a little bit about, or just a little bit, but about the social skills, and that persons, individuals with the Williams syndrome are quite social. And do they need to, like, be somewhat protected when it comes to being social?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, yeah, absolutely. So although again, we say they're social, they are social. They look for other people.
Yeah.
But again, they have very few relationships with peers, meaningful relationships.
Correct.
That might be because of their interests might be different. They might be 6 years old, but actually chronologically, the child with Williams syndrome is 4.
Yeah.
They're going to have the interest of a 4-year-old. They're not going to have the interest of a 6-year-old.
Correct.
So
they will struggle to maintain social relationships.
That's right, because you might have different interests. So that's just different ages come with different kind of interests. So we'd say in schools it's helpful to have what we call buddy systems.
Yeah.
Not all parents would like other parents to know, or children to know, that a child's got Williams syndrome, although most children like to give a presentation about Williams syndrome, what it is, what their strengths are, what they might need help with. They have other people.
This is me.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then as they get older, indeed, they're vulnerable. So they go up to strangers. This is how I started working with a person with Williams syndrome. The first time I arrived at the Williams syndrome meeting, a young person with Williams syndrome came up and said, "Are you the secretary of my dad? And what are you doing here?" And, had no fear of this person, meeting them for the first time. But of course, you can imagine what that might look like if you're in a secondary school, or if you're a young adult.
Yeah.
You have a credit card and people say, "Buy me a beer," or "Buy me a car." And then the person with Williams syndrome says, "Of course I will do this." And, so they are vulnerable from that point of view. And definitely, we teach them stranger danger, how to recognize when someone is your friend or your foe. But it's difficult.
Yeah, and we guess that when it comes to the more lifelong perspective and going from child to youth and adult, of course, the social skills and how to maneuver in society, and the skills that you need to be an independent individual, and this goes for everyone. We have to learn these kind of skill sets, and I would guess that for individuals with Williams syndrome, you have to you have to be shown, and you have to play role playing, and so
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a lot of repetition needed in learning, and this is an interesting one. Is always when we talk about how people go from one place to another. So very few of them can drive. I've met 1 or 2 people with Williams syndrome who can drive, but because of their distractibility, it's difficult for them. But the same thing, taking the bus. They take a lot of training to take the bus. Which bus is it? But then from that moment that bus is a bit later and another bus comes, they might jump onto the wrong bus because they forget to check the bus number and they end up in a different place. Or the bus takes a detour. Or for younger people, it's the fact that, they met a cat and they love cats, and then they follow the cat, and then, they get lost. So a lot of repetition is required to help them with their independence. But also things like seeing danger, with making a sandwich, making a cup of tea, making sure you don't put a house on fire.
Yeah.
Y- it- it-
They're
the-
recognizing those. Yeah. Okay.
those situations
Yeah.
where and some of them are quite good and quite independent, but other individuals with Williams syndrome, again, when they get distracted, when
Yeah.
they get tired, when they go, oh, I love that piece of music, or someone comes and rings their doorbell, and then they start chatting and they forget all about the fact that they have something in the oven that might put your house on fire, for example.
Correct.
It's often the distractibility that is the most difficult aspect.
Correct. And I mentioned previously in our conversation that I recorded another episode in the past week, and during that conversation, the fact of the need to rest and to pause and to like after a session of in a school or a concert or where we have you have you need to rest and to well, could you, and you mentioned a bit about that now, but do people with the Williams syndrome have how do they need to rest more than like their normal being?
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of research done on sleep problems in individuals with Williams syndrome, and the only difficulty is that they often have problems falling asleep. So there's no difference necessarily in their sleep quality.
Okay.
So, but it takes them a long time to fall asleep. So from that point of view, is that they don't necessarily need more rest, but as I mentioned before, is their brain processes information differently.
Yeah.
And so it's like if you've been in a very busy, loud concert the whole day with lots of information coming at you, you feel tired.
Yeah.
We live in an environment or in a society where everything has become faster, right?
Yeah.
You can do a lot of things, but they're constantly under pressure to do things fast.
Faster, yeah.
And so this is why they become more tired. Because their brain takes longer to process information, and they also feel more easier overwhelmed by the noise, the sound, the visual input, the demands,
the sensoric input.
That's right.
Yeah.
But also the demands, right? Like let's do this, let's do that, and
faster.
An answer and more. Yeah, exactly.
Correct. Okay. Now we have been talking during our conversation about child to youth and adult, but before we get to the two final questions, regarding the lifelong perspective, could you just what do we know about that aspect?
So when people with Williams syndrome, some have a shorter lifespan if they've got severe SVAS. There are some complications in terms of medical complications that may affect some younger people. But in general, people with Williams syndrome also grow old, in their 60s, 70s. And we now even have someone who's 80 years old with Williams syndrome, which is the average lifespan for people. We also see that learning doesn't stop in people with Williams syndrome. So we've done a number of longitudinal studies where we've assessed the same individuals when they were in their 20s and also younger, and then again when they were in their 40s and 60s. And what you see is that there's a continuation in terms of mathematical abilities. They keep improving. So it's not like you don't go to school anymore, it's done, So it doesn't mean, and I think that's an important message, because what we see in England especially is that a lot of adults with Williams syndrome no longer get opportunities to really participate in society. They often, they might volunteer 1 day a week, but it means that 6 days a week they sit at home. They have no stimulation. And actually knowing that individuals with Williams syndrome could continue to improve.
Lifelong learners.
Yeah. Actually might provide them with more opportunities if we were to really embrace that. So, they have long lives, and we should make them long, fulfilling lives.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely perfect. Now, Jo, we have now, 8 minutes left. So, from all of what we've been talking about through this conversation? What do you want the listener to take home from this conversation?
Oh, that's a difficult one. All right, let me think about this. I think people with Williams syndrome are unique. You know, like everybody's unique, every person's unique.
Yeah.
But as a syndrome, they're really unique in terms of the what we call the uneven profiles, in terms of, you know, very socially driven, but yet having difficulties in terms of social relationships. Their cognitive profiles of strengths and difficulties, and they're such a pleasure to work with. You know, they working with people with Williams syndrome always makes me smile.
I can agree to that. Absolutely. Yeah. Very good, thank you. And a closing tip of the day. You mentioned your book, but do you have another resource that is of value for you that you want to share, pass on?
I think having worked with a lot of individuals with Williams syndrome and families over the last 25 years, there is one question that always comes back. And I think my biggest message, and I mentioned it earlier on, is around every person with Williams syndrome is unique and they're following their own developmental trajectory. So it is about, you know, they will get there. We, you know, with support, just have to be patient in terms of their development.
Perfect. A good closure for a very interesting conversation. So once again, thank you very much for taking the time to join the Corner of Special Education, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much for having me, Kirsten. Best of luck.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That concludes this year's anniversary episode. But before our ways part, remember to follow the podcast on Spotify or where you listen to podcasts. Also, remember to follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook. Also, if you want the latest news and posts from the blog, you can sign up to the newsletter from spesblog.no. If you have any comments or want to get in touch, don't hesitate to send me a PM or email at question@spesblog.no. As always, I really appreciate if you rate, share and recommend the podcast. I'm truly grateful to Professor Herwegen for joining this anniversary episode, to all of my guests over these first years, and to the future guests. Finally, to all of you who have followed and listened to the podcast these first 3 years, thank you so much. If you'd like to make a voluntary contribution to the podcast and blog, you can find further details in the description of this episode. And I'm really looking forward to show you what's in store for the next episodes, seasons, and years. So stay tuned. All the best.